you guys, and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are already part of the family, for those of you who are new, welcome. My name is Kiara Selena. I am a licensed practical nurse, and on my channel I mainly make nursing related videos, but we also do a bit of beauty and hair. So in this video, as mentioned in the beginning of the video, as well as the title, we are going to be talking about the differences or some of the differences between nursing in Canada and the United States. For those of you who don't know, I am a licensed practical nurse in Canada, not in the US. However, I know that a lot of my viewers are from the United States. So even though you guys are in the United States, this might still be informative for those of you who are thinking maybe about coming to Canada to nurse, or for those of you who are just curious. So the first thing I want to talk about is the titles. Now, some of the titles change depending on what province you're in. So sometimes you guys may hear me say something and you guys would be confused about what that abbreviation means, but I'm gonna tell you guys the differences right now. First thing I want to talk about are the titles. So we have similar titles, however, there are some differences depending on what province you come from. So I'm gonna share those titles with you guys. So obviously the first one we're gonna start off with is registered nurse. Registered nurse is pretty much the same thing everywhere. We have BSN nurses and BSN registered nurses, as well as BN, bachelors in nursing or bachelors in science of nursing. So that is pretty standard. Then we have LPNs, licensed practical nurses or registered practical nurses. In the province of Ontario, instead of calling practical nurses licensed practical nurses, they call them registered practical nurses. Then I want to talk about PSW, so personal support worker, which is similar to a CNA, I guess. That would pretty much be the equivalent. So PSW in Canada would be the same thing as CNA. However, there are some provinces that call CNAs CNAs. So PSW is not something that, or an abbreviation that is used all throughout Canada. Some provinces use it, other provinces just use CNA. And another abbreviation for CNA in Canada is PAB in French in Quebec, which is the province that I live in, which stands for Préposé aux bénéficiaires, which is pretty much the same thing as a CNA or a PSW. Lastly, we have healthcare aide, which is HCA, which is pretty much the same thing as a CNA. I think HCAs mainly or mostly work in home care. So it would be like the same thing as like a home care aide, or pretty much the same thing, also as similar to a CNA or a PSW. So that's pretty much it for the difference in titles. Now I want to talk about the length for schooling, or the difference between schooling in America and in Canada. So I'm going to start off by licensed practical nurses or registered practical nurses. So in the States, for the most part, I'm not saying that this is the same thing everywhere, but for the most part, the average duration of time of schooling time for a licensed practical nurse in the USA is about 12 months or a year, right? However, in Canada, it's double that time. So for licensed practical or registered practical nurses, instead of 1 year of schooling, we do 2 years of schooling. So 2 years versus 1 year to become a practical nurse, which brings me to my next point, which is ADNs. Now, there is only one province in Canada that has ADN nurses, right? The rest of Canada does not have ADN nurses. In order to practice as a registered nurse in Canada, you have to have a bachelor in science of nursing or a bachelor in nursing, which generally takes about 4 years of time to do. So we can basically say that Canada doesn't have ADN nurses, because even the ADN nurses in the province of Quebec, if they wanted to go practice as registered nurses outside of their province, they would not be able to. They would have to work as licensed practical nurses, and they would have to go back to school to get the equivalent to the bachelor in order to be able to practice as a registered nurse. So we're gonna like kind of erase the ADNs and act like they don't exist. I'm sorry for all of you ADNs who are watching me. Well, ADNs in Canada at least, but pretty much the only two options for nursing that you have in Canada is licensed practical nurse or registered nurse, and like I said, you need a bachelor for that. that's pretty much all I wanted to share. Let's talk about the scope of practice for nurses. So registered nurses, it doesn't really matter where you are in North America, whether you're in Canada, whether you are in the States, the scope of practice for registered nurses is pretty much the same, pretty much standard. And like I said, we only have registered nurses that have their bachelor's. So a nurse who has a bachelor's in nursing or bachelor's in science of nursing will have pretty much the same scope of practice as a person who has a bachelor in nursing in the States, right? So they've went to school, they got, you know, really high education in nursing. They could pretty much do the full scope when it comes to nursing, from the very basics to, like, you know, very advanced skills. And most bachelor nurses have head nurse or charge nurse or some type of supervisor position, right? So that's pretty standard. Where the difference comes between Canada and the US is for licensed practical nurses. So because in Canada we have double the time of schooling than the States, or than practical nurses in the States, our scope of practice is a little bit broader, especially when it comes to IV medications. So like I said, there's one province that has ADN nurses, and in that province, the practical nurses are not administering IV medications. You can stop a pump with IV medications, and you can also administer IVs, but only IV fluids with no additives. Now, in the other provinces, LPNs are administering IV medications. I think it might be under the supervisor of a nurse, but they are administering IV medication. And because most of these BSN nurses have more office work to do, or their jobs are mainly, you know, in offices, there are some BSN nurses who do work bedside, but for the most part, a lot of them do more office work, a lot more charge nurse, you know, type of jobs. And so that leaves us with practical nurses. And because the reason why can't I speak? Because we go to school for longer, and because we can do IV medications, that opens a lot more doors for us in terms of where we can work. So in a lot of places, a lot of people think that LPNs are limited to long-term care, which is not true. You can work in hospitals, but there are certain areas in the hospital that's harder to get into as a licensed practical nurse. For example, the ICU, the NICU, or the ER. But because of the extra schooling that LPNs get in Canada, and because our scope of practice is a little bit broader than in the United States, you will find licensed practical nurses working in these areas. Now, I'm not saying that it is impossible for you to do so if you're in the United States. I'm just saying because of the schooling, it is a little bit harder in the United States. And so you see a lot of licensed practical nurses really working in residences. You do see some in the hospital as well, but it's a lot easier for them to get it's a lot easier for practical nurses in the US to get jobs in residences as opposed to hospitals, whereas in Canada there is a plethora, there is literally an abundance of job opportunities for practical nurses in hospitals and a lot more advanced settings. I want to talk about the salary in Canada, and I was doing some research on this, but I want us to really like calculate the math here. Generally, nurses in Canada get paid well. If you guys haven't seen my video on LPN salaries throughout Canada, where I also share how much I was making as a new grad, then you go check that out. But for the most part, nurses, whether you're a registered or licensed practical nurse or registered nurse, in Canada, we get paid pretty well. I think the lowest I've seen for a licensed practical nurse in Canada was like $21. That's like the lowest I've seen. It can go below that if you work in private facilities, and that's another difference that I'm quickly gonna talk about. There are private facilities and government facilities. So in these government facilities, everybody's salary matches. It doesn't matter what hospital, what clinic, what home, what residence you work at. If you work in a government facility, most times all these government facilities, even though they're like different hospitals, will try to match each other's salary. So if you work at, for example, the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal, and you are making $24 as a nurse, or you're working at the Royal Victoria Hospital for McGill University, which are two completely different hospitals, two completely different companies, because they are both government owned, the salary will be the same. Right? The only exception is for these private facilities where you get paid a little bit less, but there's also a pro to that because you are taxed a lot less. In government-owned facilities, you get paid well, However, you get taxed a lot because you get paid more. Obviously, the more you get paid, the more you're taxed. So you get paid more, you get taxed a lot. You have to pay for your union dues. You are obligated to take some type of healthcare insurance. You guys know that healthcare in Canada is free, but it's not free because this gets deducted from we get taxed for healthcare and it gets deducted from our pay. So we are paying for our healthcare, but I mean, I rather pay, you know, $30 every paycheck or $20 every paycheck so that if I get sick or if anything happens to me, I can go to the hospital, get full care, you know, get sent back home without having to worry about a bill. That's also another difference. So even though in Canada we get paid a little bit more, we also have to consider the fact that the cost of living in most places in Canada will be slightly higher than in the States, and because of the whole healthcare thing, that is deducted from our salary, as well as the taxes that we also, you know, our taxes are also very, very high because of healthcare and because our schooling is also basically free. So yes, we get paid more, but when you do the math, I'm pretty sure it comes up to around the same thing. But I have heard of some nurses, some registered nurses in America telling me that they were getting job offers for like $18 an hour, whereas in Canada, the starting salary for like a new grad licensed practical nurse is almost $23. So it's a $5 difference. And some people will say, yeah, well, it's 18 US dollars, which is equivalent to this in Canada. But I mean, we're comparing two completely different countries with different currencies, with different costs of living, with different like everything. So, I mean, don't do the math that way, okay? Just count it as $23 because what $23 in Canada will do for you is pretty much the same thing that y'all get what I mean. That is pretty much it for the main differences between nursing in Canada versus the US. For all of you American nurses who are maybe considering coming to the US, coming to Canada, I hope this information was informative to you. There are a lot of nursing opportunities up here in Canada too, if ever you guys want to come. I mean, free healthcare and pretty much free schooling. Yay, Canada. The US is cool too though. The US is cool for all Canadian nurses maybe thinking about going to the US. And if I made any mistakes on here about, you know, the US, or if there's anything that you guys want to add, make sure you add them down below. As usual, much love. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. I hope to see you in my next one. Bye.